No one expected a freshman lawmaker to outshine the court, until this very moment. The chamber was still, thick with the gravity of centuries of precedent, as if history itself had paused to listen. The air carried that weight only a courtroom can hold, where words cut sharper than steel and silence can feel louder than thunder. Every eye fixed on Jasmine Crockett. She stood steady, shoulders squared, gaze unflinching, as though she had carried this silence all her life and was ready to own it. Her opponent had finished speaking with smug finality, their voice dripping with certainty, expecting applause from the dignified walls around them. But there was no applause. Only stillness. All that remained was the unspoken question: what could she possibly say that might stand against the arrogance laid before her? Then Jasmine opened her mouth. Her voice rang with precision, measured, deliberate, like a steady drumbeat before a storm. The first sentence shattered the stillness, each word landing heavy enough to stir murmurs across the chamber. Gasps slipped into the air, muffled coughs tried to swallow disbelief, and Justice Stephen Breyer himself shifted in his chair, leaning forward ever so slightly. That simple movement, a justice leaning toward her, was a gesture that carried more meaning than 100 speeches. And Crockett saw it. She did not flinch. She did not blink. She let the respect in his gaze sharpen her resolve, and her words only grew stronger. With every line, she dismantled not just an argument but an entire mindset, a culture of dismissal that had long underestimated voices like hers. For a fleeting second, it was as if the court itself had been stripped bare, exposed to the brilliance it had never anticipated. The chamber felt frozen in time. The antagonists, those who doubted her, were silenced not by authority, not by power, but by the undeniable clarity of truth delivered with poise. The kind of clarity that even a justice could not ignore. In that instant, the hierarchy shifted. The room no longer belonged to the establishment. It belonged to her. But what led to this frozen moment of respect was a clash so dramatic, it shook the very walls of the court. The brilliance of that moment could only be understood by stepping back into the world that birthed it. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, Jasmine Crockett's name floated through political chatter with a tone that was anything but flattering. She was too bold, too new, the commentators said. She spoke too directly for some, too unapologetically for others. The establishment painted her as a firebrand without polish, a woman destined to be a flash in the pan rather than a figure who could command the nation's most revered chamber. The media amplified those whispers. Headlines dripped with skepticism, unseasoned and unready. Crockett's fiery words won't play in the court. Pundits filled late-night slots with smirks, suggesting she would collapse under the pressure of real scrutiny. They questioned not only her legal sharpness but her very right to stand among seasoned veterans. And though the cameras captured her smile, her critics forgot that resilience is often born in fire. Across that divide stood Justice Stephen Breyer. A man of immense stature, respected even by ideological rivals, Breyer embodied the gravity of the institution itself. He was not cruel, not overtly dismissive, but his skepticism was clear. To him, Crockett seemed like another rising politician fueled more by passion than precision. He had seen countless eager voices falter when pressed beneath the weight of tradition and law. Many expected him to watch her performance with polite disinterest, perhaps even quiet disapproval. For a freshman lawmaker, there was no heavier figure to impress, or disappoint. The courtroom on that day was stacked against her. Her opponent was seasoned, battle-tested, confident in the power of reputation. The audience was filled with insiders who had already written the script in their minds. Crockett would speak, she would stumble, and her stumble would confirm everything they had predicted. It was not a fair stage, it was a crucible designed to humiliate. And yet, it was also the perfect stage for a transformation. Beneath the whispers, something else was stirring. Among younger voices, among immigrants and dreamers, among those too often told they didn't belong, Crockett was more than a politician, she was a mirror. They saw in her the audacity of representation, the courage to walk into a room designed to exclude her and stand taller because of it. That was her hidden power, she carried a multitude with her. Justice Breyer, for all his skepticism, was not blind to history. He had watched great orators rise and fall, had seen truth slice through arrogance like lightning. Still, no part of him anticipated that this day would deliver such a moment. To him, Crockett was another name on the docket, another ambitious voice soon to be drowned in the sea of precedent. But that expectation was precisely why her words carried the weight they did. Because what she was about to say would not only silence the doubters in that room, it would ripple far beyond its walls. It would redefine what courtroom drama meant for a generation raised to believe brilliance must fit a narrow mold. And so, as the murmurs swelled and the pressure mounted, the stage was no longer just a chamber of law. It became a battlefield of perception, a trial of identity, and a test of endurance. The silence that would follow her words was not just silence, it was history gasping. But before her brilliance stunned the court, the stage was set with a villain who believed they could easily dismiss her. Every great drama requires its foil, and in this courtroom spectacle, the role of antagonist was filled by a figure who seemed almost sculpted from the marble of privilege itself. He was a senior counsel, a man whose resume stretched across decades of high-profile cases, his reputation gilded by connections rather than courage. In the circles of power, he was known less for what he fought for and more for how he maneuvered, always finding a way to be on the winning side, always perched comfortably in the lap of elitism. His voice carried the polished ease of someone who had never been interrupted, never been doubted in rooms where everyone already agreed he belonged. When he spoke, it wasn't merely argument, it was performance. He wore condescension like a tailored suit, each smirk a punctuation mark meant to remind everyone of his superiority. To him, the court was his stage, and his confidence was not born of righteousness but of repetition. He had done this 1,000 times before, and every fiber of his being suggested he believed this time would be no different. And then came Jasmine Crockett. To the antagonist, she was a mere inconvenience, a freshman voice meant to be brushed aside. In his eyes, she was symbolic of what he considered the decay of tradition, too bold, too unapologetic, too unwilling to defer to the established order. His arrogance was not just directed at her words but at her very existence in this space. The quiet implication in every smirk, every dismissive gesture, was that she did not deserve to be here. Yet for all his supposed brilliance, his blind spot was glaring. He had built a career insulated from challenge, thriving in a world that measured worth by pedigree and connections. He underestimated the power of resilience born from struggle. He had never faced the fire of being doubted at every turn, of being told you did not belong and proving otherwise with every breath. And so, when confronted with someone forged in precisely that fire, he mistook composure for weakness and boldness for recklessness. His contradictions ran deeper still. For years, he had styled himself as a defender of the Constitution, a voice for fairness and order. Yet behind closed doors, his record told a different story, defending corporations that preyed on the vulnerable, using legal gymnastics to justify exclusion, framing elitism as tradition. He wore the language of justice but wielded it to protect power. To him, equality was an ideal for speeches, not a reality to be practiced. This hypocrisy was invisible to many who admired his career, but not to Jasmine Crockett. She had seen men like him before, men who wielded authority not as a duty, but as a shield. Men who confused entitlement with intellect. Men who believed that because history had bent in their favor, it always would. And as he leaned into his familiar tactics, condescending tones, exaggerated sighs, theatrically arched eyebrows, he unknowingly wrote the script for his own unraveling. The arrogance with which he dismissed her was not just personal, it was cultural. He represented the narrative that had followed countless women of color into rooms of power, that they were either too loud or too timid, too inexperienced or too unpredictable, never quite fitting the mold demanded of them. He did not see Jasmine as an equal opponent. He saw her as a temporary disruption, something to swat away before continuing his comfortable dominance. What he did not realize was that audiences, inside and outside the chamber, were hungry for this exact confrontation. They were weary of the smirks, the patronizing tones, the endless recycling of elitist logic that always seemed to end with the same people in power. He believed he was untouchable, that the chamber was his domain, and that a freshman lawmaker would pose no threat to his carefully cultivated image. But arrogance is a dangerous companion. It blinds. It dulls the senses. It convinces you that history will always repeat in your favor. And in that blindness, he failed to notice the subtle shift in the air, the tension building not just in Crockett's posture but in the energy of the room itself. He did not see the inevitability of what was coming. For all his smirks, for all his dismissive sighs, for all the applause he had grown accustomed to in rooms like these, he never imagined that this time would be different. He never imagined that his opponent carried within her a story far more powerful than the veneer of elitism. But what the antagonist didn't know was that Jasmine's story had forged her into something far stronger than they imagined. To understand why Jasmine Crockett stood so unshaken in that chamber, you have to travel far from the marble halls of the court. Her story didn't begin in polished rooms of privilege, but in neighborhoods where the law was often felt more as a weight than a shield. She grew up surrounded by stories of struggle, where families worked multiple jobs just to make ends meet, where opportunity was something you fought for rather than something handed down. From a young age, she carried an awareness of injustice like a constant shadow. She saw how easily power overlooked the powerless, how voices were muted simply because they didn't fit the mold of what authority wanted to hear. For many, these realities bred silence. But for Jasmine, they ignited something else, a determination to refuse invisibility. She put herself through school, often juggling work that paid the bills with studies that fed her dreams. Nights were long, sacrifices countless. While others coasted on family legacies or networks of influence, Jasmine built her foundation brick by brick, forged out of discipline and persistence. What she lacked in resources, she more than made up for in grit. Each closed door became an invitation to find another way in. Each dismissal only sharpened her resolve. When she entered the world of law, she chose not the comfortable path but the necessary one. She became a public defender, standing beside people the system would rather forget. Day after day, she walked into courtrooms stacked against her clients, facing prosecutors who assumed they'd already won before the hearing began. And day after day, she fought. She learned that truth alone wasn't enough, you had to deliver it with precision, with composure, with a fire that burned steady rather than wild. It was in those courtrooms that her poise was born. When judges rolled their eyes, when opposing counsel muttered dismissive remarks under their breath, she didn't break. She absorbed it, transformed it, and sent it back as arguments so airtight that even the most skeptical had to pause. Those battles, invisible to most, became her training ground. They armed her with weapons far more powerful than arrogance, truth, resilience, and the ability to stand calm in the face of storms. Her leap into politics carried those same qualities. She was never the candidate handpicked by insiders. She was the challenger, the disruptor, the one told she didn't have a chance. And yet, she built her campaigns the same way she built her life, grassroots, from the ground up. She knocked on doors others ignored. She listened to stories that rarely made the headlines. She carried not just policies but people with her, weaving their struggles into her platform until it became impossible to separate the candidate from the community. Her voice, unapologetic and unflinching, wasn't born from theory. It was born from lived reality. Every time she stood on a stage, she carried the weight of those who had been silenced, the pride of those who had been told to wait their turn, the hope of those who believed America could be more than a hierarchy of privilege. Critics called her too bold. She called it honesty. They said she lacked polish. She called it refusing to lie. And that's why her presence in the court on that day was so much larger than one person standing before a bench of justices. She wasn't there only as Jasmine Crockett, the freshman lawmaker. She was there as a vessel for countless voices who had been told their brilliance was too loud, their ambition too disruptive, their presence too inconvenient. This wasn't just about her career, it was about dignity, justice, and the voices she carried with her. The irony is that her opponents mistook this history as weakness. They believed her grassroots beginnings, her uphill battles, her outsider status, would leave her rattled in the intimidating grandeur of the court. But those very struggles had done the opposite. They had built her into a figure who could not be rattled, who thrived in moments where the odds were stacked. Where others saw intimidation, she saw opportunity. Where others trembled, she found stillness. And so, when the moment came, when the courtroom lights hit and the gavel echoed through the chamber, she did not shrink. She did not falter. All those years of sacrifice, of carrying other people's burdens, of turning doubt into determination, they became her armor. And when the courtroom lights hit, those battles became her armo. The chamber returned to life with the voice of the antagonist. He rose with practiced confidence, adjusting his suit as though the very act of standing was a performance in authority. His words dripped with condescension, a calm yet deliberate attempt to remind the audience who truly belonged here and who, in his view, did not. He smiled faintly as he spoke, each sentence laced with the suggestion that Jasmine's arguments were naive, simplistic, the product of someone who had read the rulebook but never understood the game. "You see," he said, gesturing broadly, "this is where passion and experience diverge. The honorable member may have spirit, but spirit is not substance. In these chambers, we deal in reason, not rhetoric." The smirk that followed was subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't simply aimed at her, it was aimed at the idea of her, the notion that someone like Jasmine Crockett could ever hold her own against the weight of his years. Gasps were muffled, and a few chuckles rippled from the corners of the room. The antagonistic theater was working on some of the audience, at least momentarily. But Jasmine remained still. Her hands rested lightly on the table before her. Her gaze never wavered. Where others might have flushed with embarrassment or flinched under the sting of ridicule, she sat with a serenity that seemed to unnerve him more than any protest could. Her silence was not weakness, it was patience. And in that patience, the atmosphere began to shift. Justice Breyer, seated above, leaned back in his chair. His expression was thoughtful, his eyes fixed not on the counsel but on Jasmine herself. There was doubt, yes, but also something else, curiosity. He had heard countless exchanges in his career, witnessed the dance of arguments where arrogance often crushed inexperience. But something about Jasmine's composure tugged at his attention. It was as though she was waiting for the perfect note in a symphony, refusing to waste her energy until the moment mattered most. The antagonist pressed on, sensing victory. He raised his voice slightly, layering his dismissal with theatrics. The honorable member confuses passion for proof, conviction for clarity. And while her words may inspire headlines, they cannot stand against the weight of established reason. He paused dramatically, expecting applause from the silent chamber. None came. The room was listening, but not in the way he imagined. The tension was building, waiting for the inevitable response. Jasmine finally moved. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice cutting into the air with calm precision. With respect, she began, her tone steady, measured, commanding silence without demanding it. Substance is not the property of those who simply claim it. Substance is tested in truth. The murmurs returned, louder this time. She had not raised her voice, but the contrast between her quiet confidence and his performative arrogance was stark. Her words did not chase approval, they claimed it. The antagonist shifted, just slightly, his smirk faltering for the briefest moment. He recovered quickly, but the shift had been seen. And in the gallery, the audience leaned forward, caught in the electricity of what was unfolding. The duel had begun, not of volume, but of vision. His weapon was arrogance polished by years of privilege. Hers was truth, honed sharp by struggle. Blow by blow, the energy in the room tilted. Justice Breyer leaned forward now, his hand brushing his chin, his gaze narrowing. He had not yet spoken, but his attention was no longer neutral. He was listening, not to the counsel who had long commanded this chamber, but to the young lawmaker whose composure was beginning to bend the room toward her. And then came the exchange that left even Justice Breyer leaning forward in disbelief. The silence stretched, heavy, expectant. The antagonist had just finished his carefully rehearsed dismissal, certain that he had secured the upper hand. He sat with that smug confidence that had carried him through decades of easy victories, his eyes darting toward the audience as if to invite their applause. But none came. The stillness in the chamber was no longer his to control, it belonged to Jasmine Crockett. She stood slowly, as if giving the moment permission to build. Her hands rested on the desk for a heartbeat before she let them fall to her sides, unclenched, calm. When she spoke, her voice was not raised, it was steady, deliberate, commanding attention in the way a whisper commands silence in a storm. With respect, she began, her gaze locked on her opponent, "You've mistaken eloquence for truth and arrogance for wisdom. But the difference between the two is that truth does not tremble under scrutiny, and today, I invite the world to scrutinize." The words rippled across the chamber like a current. A few heads lifted, eyes narrowing. Justice Breyer leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, watching closely. Jasmine paused, letting the silence breathe, then continued. "You tell me passion is not substance. But what is substance if not the lived reality of millions whose rights hang in the balance? What is clarity if not exposing contradictions you'd rather leave in shadow?" Her opponent shifted uncomfortably. The smirk had not fully disappeared, but it flickered now, a candle in a sudden draft. Jasmine took a step forward. "You defend the idea that tradition grants legitimacy. But tradition has defended injustice as often as it has defended truth. Tradition once said women could not vote. Tradition once said people of color had no standing in this court. Tradition has been wrong before, and it is wrong again today if it is used as a shield for arrogance instead of a tool for justice." The gallery erupted in a low murmur. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and a faint of approval could be heard from a few seats behind her. She continued, her tone sharpening but never losing composure. "You claim that I bring rhetoric, not reason. Yet reason without courage is cowardice in a suit. And courage without reason is chaos. The balance of the two, that is where justice lives. That is what this chamber should demand. And that is what I bring today." The antagonist leaned back, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. His eyes darted to the justices, searching for a signal of support. None came. Jasmine raised her hand, a single finger pointed to the thick binder of evidence on her desk. She opened it slowly, deliberately, as if every movement was part of her orchestration. "You say I have spirit but not substance. Let me show you substance." She pulled out document after document, citing specific cases where his arguments had collapsed under review, where his clients had exploited loopholes at the expense of the powerless. She quoted his own words from past hearings, contradictions glaring in the light of her calm delivery. Each fact landed like a hammer, each pause giving the weight of her words room to reverberate in the chamber. At one point, she looked directly at him and said, "You want to dismiss me as inexperienced. But perhaps it is not inexperience you fear, it is relevance. Because the world has changed, and arrogance no longer passes for authority. Not here. Not anymore." Gasps filled the air. One woman in the gallery covered her mouth. The antagonist's jaw clenched visibly, his posture stiffening. For the first time, he had no clever smirk, no dismissive sigh. He looked cornered, a veteran unaccustomed to being outflanked. And then, the moment that froze the room. Justice Stephen Breyer, who had been leaning forward with intent focus, raised his hand ever so slightly. The chamber fell silent. All eyes turned to him. His voice was calm but carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "Counselor," he said, addressing Jasmine directly. "Your reasoning is, not only sound, but necessary. You've articulated a truth here that this chamber too often forgets, that justice must not hide behind tradition. I thank you for that clarity." The gasp this time was collective, like a wave rolling through the room. A justice interrupting not to challenge, not to correct, but to acknowledge and respect her. It was validation at the highest level. Cameras flashed, pens flew across notepads, whispers swirled into the air. The antagonist's face flushed a deep shade of red. Jasmine did not smile, did not gloat. She only nodded, acknowledging the respect with the same composure that had carried her through every uphill battle of her life. Her victory was not in the humiliation of her opponent, but in the dignity of her delivery, in the undeniable truth that had risen above arrogance. She closed her binder slowly, looked back at the bench, and said, "Justice does not belong to tradition alone. It belongs to the people, and it must serve them all, without fear or favor." The gallery broke into restrained but audible applause before being hushed by the court officer. Yet the sound lingered, echoing in the minds of everyone present. Her opponent lowered his gaze, shuffling papers with the hollow theatrics of a man trying to regain ground already lost. But it was too late. The tide had turned, and the chamber knew it. For a brief, electric moment, history seemed to hover in the room. A freshman lawmaker had not only defended herself against one of the most seasoned voices in the establishment, she had earned the respect of a justice whose approval carried the weight of generations. But the real shock wasn't in her words, it was in what happened next, as the entire country reacted. The courtroom fell into recess, but the battle was only beginning. Outside those marble walls, the moment was already metastasizing into something larger than anyone inside could have predicted. Within minutes, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's devastating counterattack was uploaded, clipped, and circulated across every platform imaginable. By the time she left the building, her name was no longer just whispered in political circles, it was plastered across trending banners in bold capital letters. Hashtag Crockett cuts through. Hashtag Breyer respect. Hashtag mic drop moment. The hashtags flooded feeds like wildfire. TikTok edits set her piercing words to cinematic soundtracks. Twitter, still the gladiatorial arena of politics, erupted with side-by-side clips, Jasmine's calm, razor-sharp dismantling of her opponent, contrasted with his fidgeting, defensive collapse. The caption practically wrote itself, David vs. Goliath, Round 1. Instagram Reels replayed the exact moment Justice Breyer interrupted to commend her, slowed down, subtitled, replayed again. Users looped it with dramatic music, turning a courtroom acknowledgement into a cultural anthem. The response was not confined to ordinary citizens. Within hours, celebrities lent their voices to the chorus. A famous actor tweeted, "I've done courtroom dramas my whole career. Crockett just gave us one that wasn't scripted, and it was flawless." A Grammy-winning singer posted on Instagram, "Young, brilliant, unapologetic. That's the energy we need in America." Politicians, some cautiously, others boldly, joined in. Allies rushed to align themselves with her, calling her a voice of a new generation. Even rivals, sensing the wave, offered measured respect, careful not to appear on the wrong side of history. But the most powerful validation came from ordinary people. Teachers shared how they played the clip in classrooms, framing it as a lesson in courage and clarity. Parents posted videos of their children watching, eyes wide, declaring, "That's what a leader looks like." And the memes, oh, the memes. One viral image showed the antagonist's frozen grimace beside a lioness mid-roar, captioned, "Arrogance meets its match." Another depicted Justice Breyer leaning forward with the text, "When brilliance silences the room." Humor, admiration, and pride blended into a tidal wave of cultural momentum. Cable news amplified the frenzy. Anchors dissected her every word. Pundits, some reluctantly, admitted they had underestimated her. The narrative was clear, a so-called freshman had walked into the lion's den and walked out carrying its roar. Still, not all reactions were celebratory. Some corners of the media tried to spin the moment as disrespect, as overconfidence disguised as passion. They warned that Crockett's boldness could alienate tradition. Yet those critiques felt drowned out, overshadowed by the sheer force of admiration crashing against them. For every dismissive headline, 1,000 voices online responded with conviction, "No, this is what leadership looks like." The speed of the moment was dizzying. In less than 24 hours, Jasmine Crockett had gone from a rising but underestimated voice to a household name. News alerts compared her courtroom stance to landmark moments of defiance and brilliance in American political history. In group chats, in classrooms, in offices, people weren't just talking about the case, they were talking about her. About composure under fire. About courage in the face of arrogance. About a woman who carried not just her own ambition, but the weight of every voice that had been dismissed, underestimated, or silenced. For Jasmine, though, the noise outside was not the victory. She remained calm, measured, and grounded. She knew the moment was bigger than her personal triumph. It was a shift, a signal that tradition alone could not define authority anymore, that truth delivered with precision could shake even the most rigid foundations. And as the country continued to buzz, one lesson rose above the memes, above the trending tags, above the headlines and late-night jokes. Because amid the chaos, one lesson stood taller than the rest, a truth America could not ignore. In the days that followed, Jasmine Crockett did something remarkable. She refused to make the moment about her. When microphones crowded her path, when headlines shouted her name, she steadied her voice and reframed the spectacle into something larger, something that reached beyond applause. "This isn't about me winning a debate," she said in one interview, her tone firm yet warm. "It's about proving that brilliance, dignity, and truth will always rise above arrogance. No matter who doubts us, no matter how loudly they try to dismiss us, the truth always cuts through." Her words rippled, not as self-congratulation but as an invitation. For every young black woman told she was too much. For every immigrant child told their accent was a weakness. For every working-class voice silenced in rooms of power. She turned the courtroom clash into a mirror, reflecting back a simple but undeniable truth: underestimated voices could not just endure, they could lead. The image of Justice Stephen Breyer leaning forward, eyes fixed on her with quiet respect, became more than courtroom theater. It became a symbol. To many, it looked like a passing of the torch, a gesture from an elder statesman of law toward a generation rising not by permission but by merit. His nod was replayed as often as her counterattack, celebrated as a rare moment where history bent just slightly in recognition of the future. For those watching, the lesson was deeper than politics. It was about identity. It was about justice. It was about American values stripped to their core. The notion that the daughter of struggle, carrying the scars of uphill battles, could stand in a chamber built by tradition and command it with grace, that was the American promise, alive before their eyes. And the beauty of it all was not just in what she said, but in how she carried herself. No raised voice. No theatrics. Just clarity, composure, and conviction. In a world addicted to noise, Crockett reminded people that dignity itself was a form of power. Her critics had called her inexperienced, untested, unfit for the grand stage. But when the dust settled, those same critiques only made the moment stronger. Because the lesson wasn't just that Jasmine Crockett had triumphed. It was that every label, every doubt, every dismissal had been fuel, turned into armor, transformed into resolve. America needed that reminder. At a time when cynicism felt permanent, when arrogance seemed to rule unchecked, she showed that truth still mattered. That courage could still shift the balance. That respect could still be earned not by heritage or hierarchy, but by brilliance delivered at the right moment. And so the clip lived on, not just as viral entertainment, but as testimony. Parents pointed to it as proof for their children. Teachers used it as curriculum. Organizers framed it as inspiration. And for Jasmine, it became both shield and compass, proof that her fight was never about ambition alone, it was about dignity, justice, and the voices of all those who had come before and all those still fighting to be heard. The moral was unmistakable: arrogance can sneer, it can dismiss, it can try to bury brilliance. But when brilliance stands tall, anchored by truth, lifted by dignity, it does not just rise. It shines. And as America replayed the moment, the message grew louder: this was more than a debate, it was a movement. No one in that courtroom will forget the silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's words, the way the air froze, the way even seasoned justices leaned forward, searching for steady ground. And at the center of it all was Justice Stephen Breyer, not challenging, not dismissing, but nodding with rare respect. That single gesture told a story larger than the clash itself. Brilliance had spoken, and dignity had prevailed. Moments like this remind us why we watch, why we listen, why we care. Because in a world where arrogance too often steals the spotlight, it takes courage and clarity to reclaim it. Crockett didn't just silence a courtroom, she gave voice to millions who've been overlooked, underestimated, or told to wait their turn. And that is why her moment matters to us all. It wasn't just her triumph, it was ours. It was proof that justice still recognizes truth, that power can still bow to principle, and that the next generation of leaders doesn't need permission to rise. If you believe brilliance and dignity must always triumph over arrogance, share this story. Let it echo beyond this courtroom, into homes and hearts across the nation. Subscribe and stand with us, because this is just one battle in a far greater struggle. Together, we'll keep uncovering the clashes, the truths, and the sparks of courage that define America's future. And when the next voice rises, demanding to be heard, you'll be here, ready, watching, and standing on the right side of history. This was more than a debate. This was the moment arrogance froze, and respect was born.